The Grand War Council of the Zalari Dominion convened in the towering halls of Velcor 7, a fortress world so secure that even the idea of a security breach was considered treasonous. The generals seated around the obsidian war table were the undisputed architects of conquest, the masterminds of planetary subjugation, and, as they frequently reminded themselves, the most intelligent beings in the galaxy. Yet, at this moment, their primary concern was lunch. General Rethvar, a hulking brute of crimson-hued scales, stabbed at his meal with the intensity of a battlefield charge. "I swear, if the chefs overcook the Draka meat again, I will have them vaporized," he muttered, peeling back a chunk of the still-steaming flesh. "A warrior deserves a meal with dignity." "You do realize," General Voktur said without looking up, "that vaporizing the chefs will not magically improve the cuisine." He swirled a goblet of spiced blood wine, savoring the aroma like a seasoned connoisseur. "Besides, we have far more pressing matters than your culinary grievances," Rethvar scoffed. "Ah, yes, the great human problem." He set his utensils down with theatrical exasperation. "Remind me again why we are even discussing this? They have what? A few stubborn colonies? A handful of warships? We crushed the Zelvani Armada in a single cycle, and they had an empire 10 times the size of these. What do they call themselves? Terrans." "Humans," corrected General Tarzoon, his plated fingers tapping rhythmically against the table. "They call themselves humans." Voktur leaned back, flicking a data pad onto the center of the table. It projected a shimmering display of recent reports, markedly unsettling reports, missing patrols, unexplained officer casualties, strategic outposts left intact, yet with every commanding officer dead. The deaths were not random or chaotic. They were precise. "This," Voktur said, gesturing at the projection, "is not the work of an unorganized species." Rethvar squinted at the data, his expression stuck somewhere between mild amusement and outright dismissal. "I see a lot of dead low-ranking officers. Where's the actual problem?" "The problem," Tarzoon interjected, voice clipped with impatience, "is that these officers were killed before any battles even started." Silence momentarily settled over the chamber, broken only by the sound of Rethvar chomping loudly on his meal. "I fail to see how that is our problem," he finally said between bites. "Less incompetence in the ranks, if you ask me." Voktur's fingers tightened around his goblet. "Let me put this in terms even you will understand." He leaned forward. "What do you call an enemy you cannot see, cannot predict, and cannot fight directly?" Rethvar snorted. "A myth, or a nuisance at best." Voktur's eyes narrowed. "A sniper," Tarzoon nodded. "And not just any snipers. Human snipers." This time, even Rethvar paused. He had heard of them, of course, just as one hears rumors of monsters lurking in the abyss. Warriors who could wait for days without moving, their eyes hidden behind lenses that saw farther than any natural predator. Soldiers who could hit a target through the eye socket from miles away and then vanish before anyone even realized they had been there. But rumors were one thing. Wars were fought with fleets, with real firepower. "And," he said, brushing aside the concern like an insect, "a few scattered killers hiding behind rocks will not stop an empire. Let them fire their tiny rifles. We will glass their planets and be done with it." Voktur exhaled sharply, glancing toward Tarzoon as if seeking reassurance that he wasn't the only one drowning in a sea of idiocy. "Perhaps you would be comforted to know," Tarzoon said, voice flat, "that 2 planetary governors were executed yesterday. Not in battle, not in an ambush, in their private chambers, inside shielded bunkers." Rethvar's chewing slowed slightly. "Executed how?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. "A single round through the cranium from a distance so great our security systems never detected movement." Tarzoon let that hang in the air before adding, "The guards never saw anything. They didn't even hear the shot." Rethvar wiped his mouth, suddenly less interested in his meal. "I suppose," he muttered. "That is somewhat concerning." Voktur raised a brow. "I'm not calm." Voktur slammed his fist. against the table. No, Rethavar, it is catastrophic. We are marching toward a war where our officers are dying before the first shots are even fired. Our commanders are being hunted. And the enemy? We don't know where they are. We don't even know how many of them exist. A heavy silence fell over the council. For the first time in his career, Rethavar did not have a dismissive retort. He simply sat, staring at the data pad as if willing the numbers to change. Finally, he exhaled and leaned back. Fine, he admitted. A handful of well-placed snipers, annoying, but not insurmountable. Tarzoon sighed, rubbing his temples. And this is why we will lose. Rethavar scowled. We are the Zalari Dominion. We do not lose. We have fleets, armies, entire worlds at our command. These snipers, these humans, they are nothing more than a small chime interrupted. Him. Vakhtr turned to his personal comlink. A security officer appeared on the screen, his expression tight with unease. Apologies, General, I thought you should know immediately. Vakhtr narrowed his eyes. Speak. The officer hesitated. General Vakhtr, sir. We've just received reports from the Velkor 7 command tower. Vakhtr stiffened. That was here. The officer swallowed hard. One of our senior fleet strategists was found dead in his quarters. One shot. No alarms triggered. No sign of infiltration. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, with an eerie calm, Vakhtr shut off the transmission and turned back to the table. Well, he muttered, refilling his goblet. It seems they are already here. Tarzoon's voice was barely above a whisper. The hunt has begun. And for the first time in history, the Zalari generals found themselves on the wrong end of it. The first death had been easy to dismiss. A tragic accident, perhaps. A security oversight, certainly. An unfortunate isolated event. Surely not the work of some grand, invisible threat. The second death was harder to ignore. By the third, the generals stopped sleeping near windows. Bodies were piling up, each one a meticulously placed warning. No alarms, no witnesses, just one neat hole where a skull used to be and a growing, suffocating realization that something was terribly, fundamentally wrong. Security doubled, then tripled. Motion scanners, energy dampeners, counter-sniper drones, each precaution put in place after another officer slumped over at his desk, a cold cup of blood wine spilling across his unfinished battle plans. It wasn't enough. General Rethavar, who once scoffed at the idea of primitive human tactics, now refused to sit in the same chair for more than an hour. They're watching, he muttered under his breath, pacing his war room. I can feel it. Good, General Vakhtr deadpanned, reviewing yet another casualty report. Maybe if you walk in circles long enough, they'll get dizzy. And miss. Rethavar scowled. How are you so calm? Just not stupid. He gestured at the reinforced blast doors and the shimmering personal energy shield he now wore at all times. Unlike some people, I believe in adapting. Rethavar scoffed. You look ridiculous. I look alive, Vakhtr corrected, which is more than I can say for General Tarzoon. They both turned, almost reluctantly, to the body still slumped over the grand war table. He had been talking just minutes ago. His drink was still warm. His eye socket, however, was missing. The shot had come from outside, through 3 layers of reinforced glass, across an entire kilometer of terrain, in the middle of a heavily patrolled military installation with thousands of guards, and yet no alarms, no alerts, no one saw anything. It was at this point, around the 5th or 6th inexplicable assassination, that the phrase minor nuisance was officially retired from the war reports. Now the phrase of the day was existential nightmare. The problem wasn't just that Zalari commanders were dying. The problem was that they were dying before anyone could even locate the enemy. The counter-sniper teams deployed across 3 planets had yet to detect a single confirmed human operative. Motion trackers caught nothing. Drone patrols returned, with 0 anomalies. It was as if the shots were coming from ghosts. Rethvar, previously a proud skeptic of sniper warfare, now had a new hobby: paranoia. He refused to stand near open spaces. He avoided balconies, hated windows, and distrusted shadows. When Vakter found him one evening hunched behind an upturned table, he merely raised a brow. "New seating arrangement?" "I am adapting," Rethvar barked. "You said to adapt." Vakter sighed, rubbing his temples. "This is a military command center, not a cave, Rethvar. You're acting like—" The window shattered, a single deafening crack of displaced air. Then silence. The Zalari generals froze. Then, slowly, carefully, they turned. At the end of the table, General Korin remained very still, probably because his head was missing. A single clean hole had replaced his central cranial plate. His body slumped forward a second later, smashing through his untouched meal like an afterthought. For a long moment, neither of the remaining generals spoke. Then, "I would like to formally suggest," Vakter said slowly, standing very, very carefully, "that we leave." Rethvar blinked. "You mean retreat?" "I mean move very quickly to a location that is not here." There was a brief, pride-filled pause. Then without another word, they both ran. Orders were sent, convoys scrambled. Whatever this was, whoever these humans were, they needed to get out. High-command transport ships, armed with top-tier shielding and countermeasure systems, were deployed immediately. The surviving generals boarded their respective vessels with urgency, ignoring the panicked, half-baked protestations of officers who still hadn't quite grasped the severity of the situation. "Are we sure about this, sir?" one captain asked, shifting nervously at his controls. "Leaving command post at such a critical time." "Are we sure?" Rethvar hissed, eyes wild. "That I am not next?" The captain did not have an answer to that. Engines roared to life. The convoy lifted off, ascending toward the war fleet above. A collective sigh of relief rippled through the cabins. Then a loud, concussive explosion sent every vessel into chaos. One of the command ships detonated mid-air. There had been no missile warnings, no incoming threats. Just one, single, perfect shot, directly into the fusion core of the lead vessel. No alarms. No alerts. Just an instant fiery end. Rethvar, strapped into his own seat, gripped the armrests with bone-crushing intensity. What was that? "Unclear, sir," the pilot barked, frantically rerouting power. "We detected no enemy signatures, no projectile tracking." Then another explosion, another ship, gone. This time, Rethvar saw it, or rather, he saw the lack of it. There was no missile, no energy beam, no visible anything, just impact, just consequence. The convoy was not under attack. The convoy was being systematically removed. Vaktur's voice came over the comms, hoarse with realization. "It's them." Rethvar's pulse pounded. "They're not just snipers," Vaktur continued. "They're hunters." The weight of that word settled like a final verdict. Hunters. Not soldiers, not infantry, not resistance fighters. Hunters. Patient. Silent. Unrelenting. And they were not shooting to win a battle. They were removing the very idea of leadership, one general at a time. Rethvar's mind raced. There had to be an answer, a strategy, something. Then the transmission crackled. A new voice entered the channel. Calm, neutral, human. "If you're listening," it said, "it means we let you." Silence. Then, "We're not here to fight. Your war." A pause. A heartbeat. "We're here to end it." Rethvar didn't move. Vaktur didn't speak. They just listened. Listened as one last shot rang out, and the lead ship vanished in fire. The hunt was over, and the slaughter had begun. The Zalari Dominion had faced planetary uprisings before. They had crushed revolts, dismantled enemy fleets, and executed entire civilizations to maintain their rule. But never, not in all their centuries of conquest, had they encountered an enemy that didn't fight back conventionally. An enemy that simply watched, weighted and removed them one by one. General Rethvar sat in the cold, dimly lit war chamber of his final stronghold, drenched in sweat despite the chilled air. The command fleet was gone, reduced to drifting wreckage, in orbit. The convoy meant to secure his escape had never made it past the stratosphere. One moment he had been surrounded by the finest warships of the Dominion. The next they were fireballs in the sky, taken apart by unseen hands. He was one of the last Zalari generals still breathing. For now. Across from him, General Vokter stared at the floor, his mandibles twitching as he processed the scale of their disaster. He had stopped drinking blood wine, stopped issuing orders, stopped pretending they had any control over the situation. You know, Rethvar muttered, rubbing his temples. There was a time I thought snipers were just cowardly, soldiers who didn't have the guts for real combat. Vokter looked up, his voice dry, bitter. That was 2 days ago. Exactly. Rethvar threw up his hands. 2 days ago I was confident. Now I'm wondering if it's even possible to blink without giving away my location. Vokter sighed. So we agree? We are officially in the worst possible situation? Oh, absolutely. Rethvar leaned forward. I'm fairly certain that right now, some human, somewhere, is staring at me through a scope and... A shot rang out. Both generals hit the floor instantly. For a long, agonizing moment, neither dared to move. Then cautiously, Rethvar peeked over the table. A junior officer, a bright-eyed young strategist who had been preparing a final retreat plan, now lay sprawled across the war room floor. He had never finished writing the order. Rethvar exhaled, slowly. I have never been so glad to not be the most important person in the room. Vokter didn't respond. He was staring at the ceiling, deep in thought, the weight of realization settling into his already tense features. We're not fighting soldiers, he murmured. Rethvar turned, confused. What? These humans, Vokter said, his voice unnervingly calm. They're not warriors, not in the way we understand. He gestured toward the latest casualty. This wasn't a battlefield kill. It wasn't some random skirmish. They're erasing us. No speeches, no warnings. Just... He snapped his fingers. Gone. Rethvar felt something cold creep into his gut. We were never the real target, Vokter continued. The Dominion was. The structure. The leadership. Us. For the first time, Rethvar truly understood. This wasn't a war. It was an extermination of command. The humans had bypassed their armies, ignored their fleets, and gone straight for the throat. And now, there was no one left to lead. Panic surged. The stronghold's defensive guns were still online, their ground forces still numbered in the thousands. Surely, if they held out long enough, reinforcements from another sector would arrive. Then, an alarm blared. A transmission. Jammed. A perimeter breach. No detected entry points. Another gunshot. Another officer slumped over. Vokter swallowed hard. They're inside. Rethvar, heartbeat pounding, turned toward his remaining guards. Seal the command chamber now. The thick, reinforced doors slammed shut, locking them in what was supposed to be the safest room on the planet. Neither of them believed that anymore. For a long moment, silence stretched over the chamber. Then, a voice. Calm. Neutral. Human. Good, it said. You finally stopped running. Vokter and Rethvar whirled around. A figure stood in the center of the room. Impossible. The doors had never opened. The security fields were still active. There were no alerts, no sensor breaches, nothing. Yet here he was. He wasn't armed. He didn't need to be. You're one of them, Rethvar rasped, backing away, his body trembling in a way he had never known before. The human simply tilted his head. I am, he agreed. Vokter, gripping the table like a lifeline, forced out a question. Why? His voice cracked, raw from exhaustion. Why this? Why not just fight us in open war? Why not declare yourselves? The human's expression didn't change. We tried. he said simply. You wouldn't listen. A chill ran through the room. Humanity doesn't conquer, the sniper continued, stepping forward. We don't invade. We don't take. But we do have one rule. He stopped, met their gaze. You don't get to start a war with us and survive. Silence. Complete, agonizing silence. Then a whisper of movement, so fast neither general had time to react. A gun materialized in the human's hand. 2 shots. Voktur slumped forward, eyes wide. Rethvar hit the ground, gasping. He lay there, blinking up at the ceiling, barely processing the warmth pooling beneath him. His limbs felt distant, disconnected, his breath shallow. The human kneeled beside him. You ignored the warnings, he said quietly. And now, there's nothing left to save. Rethvar tried to speak, but his voice failed, his vision blurred. The war room darkened. The last thing he heard before everything faded was the soft click of the human's weapon as it vanished back into its holster. The war was over, and the Zalari Dominion had lost. The fall of the Zalari Dominion wasn't loud. There were no dramatic last stands, no desperate fleet engagements, no heroic sacrifices. There was only silence. A creeping, dreadful quiet that spread across the empire like a shadow, consuming everything in its path. At first, the Zalari admirals assumed it was a communication failure, an issue with long-range relays perhaps, an unfortunate but temporary inconvenience. They sent repair teams, recalibrated satellites, adjusted frequencies. No responses came back. Then came the distress beacons. Fragmented, panicked messages from distant outposts. Some cut off mid-transmission, others devolved into whispers of pure fear. By the time the full weight of what was happening settled in, it was already too late. The command structure had collapsed. Every high-ranking general, every supreme strategist, every political leader with the authority to hold the empire together, gone. Removed so systematically, so efficiently, that the remaining officers were left leaderless and adrift, like a fleet without a flagship. It was a power vacuum the size of a galaxy, and nature hated a vacuum. On some worlds, local governors declared themselves rulers of independent states eager to carve out their own petty kingdoms. On others, entire populations revolted, emboldened by the sheer absence of their once feared overlords. The great war machine of the Dominion, once unstoppable, now fractured overnight. And humanity? Humanity watched. Admiral Elias Carter stood on the bridge of the USS Blackout, arms folded behind his back, watching the chaos unfold on the tactical display. His fleet, hidden behind layers of advanced cloaking, had remained untouched throughout the entire campaign. A younger officer, fresh-faced and still adjusting to the idea that they had just toppled a galactic empire without firing a single battle, hesitated before speaking. "Sir, is that it?" Carter raised an eyebrow. "That depends. What do you mean by it?" The officer gestured at the display. "I mean, we didn't destroy their fleets. We didn't invade. We didn't—" He searched for the right words. "Fight them, not like they expected." Carter smirked. "You sound disappointed." "No, sir, just surprised. We just removed a few high-ranking officers and now their entire empire is—" He gestured vaguely at the display, where Zalari warships were firing on each other as factional infighting took over. "Self-destructing." Carter sighed, stepping forward and tapping the screen. "You're thinking of war in the way the Zalari did. Battleships, front lines, blowing things up to prove a point." The officer nodded slowly. "Isn't that how war works?" Carter chuckled. "That's how stupid war works. Real war?" He tapped the display again, zooming in on a dozen high-profile Zalari officers scrambling for control in a government that no longer existed. Real war is understanding that empires don't run on fleets, they run on people. And when you remove the right people— The officer watched as the last transmission hub went dark. Carter smiled. "The whole thing collapses under its own weight." The young officer exhaled, looking at the admiral with a new kind of respect. "Brutal," he muttered. Carter nodded. Effective. The Zalari, for all their military might, had never considered the possibility that an enemy might refuse to fight them directly. They had prepared for planetary sieges, orbital bombardments, grand battles between flagships and dreadnoughts. But humanity? Humanity had simply walked into their house, unplugged the lights, and left them to eat each other in the dark. A transmission request blinked on the display. Carter's smirk faded. The bridge fell silent as the communication link crackled to life. Single Zalari face appeared on screen. Overlord Jekai Moore, one of the last surviving members of the High War Council, looked hollow. His once proud armor was scuffed and cracked. His eyes, once burning with confidence, now flickered with something dangerously close to desperation. You, he hissed. His voice was hoarse, like a man who had been screaming for days. You did this. Carter tilted his head. Did what? You killed my people. Jekai Moore snarled, his mandibles twitching. You assassinated our leaders. You dismantled our empire from the inside. Carter let a slow breath escape through his nose. Technically, he said, we didn't kill your people. Your people are currently killing each other over a throne that no longer exists. Jekai Moore's mandibles clenched. You think this is victory? Carter shrugged. I think this is consequences. You started a war with a species you didn't understand. And now you're realizing, he leaned in slightly, eyes locked onto the defeated warlord, that you were never the apex predator. Jekai Moore trembled with rage. Carter waited for the final angry threat, the last desperate vow of vengeance. Instead, the Zalari warlord slumped forward, pressing both hands against his face. You, he whispered, you could have taken everything. You could have ruled us. Carter blinked. Yeah, that sounds like a lot of work. The warlord's gaze snapped back up. You're lying, he snarled. You wanted this. You wanted us to burn. Carter's expression softened, just a little. No, he said. We wanted you to leave, us alone. We wanted to exist without someone pointing a gun at our heads. Jekai Moore's jaw tightened. Carter exhaled. But you didn't listen. Silence. Finally, the warlord's shoulders sagged. Carter leaned forward. This is the part where you ask for peace. Jekai Moore swallowed hard. And if I do? Carter tilted his head. Then humanity will leave your people alone for real this time, but if you ever try this again, he let the silence stretch. Jekai Moore waited. Carter smiled. Not a friendly smile, not cruel either, just patient, knowing. The warlord shuddered. Understood, Jekai Moore muttered. The transmission cut off. A quiet hum filled the bridge. The young officer, still absorbing what had just happened, turned toward Carter. Do you think they'll actually keep their word? Carter tapped a few controls, watching as the last of the Zalari warships jumped to deep space. They don't have a choice. The bridge crew exhaled in collective relief. Humanity had won. Without an invasion, without a drawn-out war, the Zalari had chosen their fate, and they had learned in the most painful way possible what it meant to ignore a human sniper. Carter stretched, cracked his knuckles, and turned to his crew. All right, he said. Who's hungry?